Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the fashion seminar of Fashion in Helsinki 2021. My name is Ervin Latimer. I'm a fashion designer and writer and managing editor of Ruskeat, Tytöt, Finland's first media platform for people of color, by people of color. Today we're in the part 2 of our discussion. The topic is, or in this topic, we're reflecting on inclusivity and marginalized identities in fashion design. And with me is someone who I think is really exciting in fashion at the moment, Bianca Saunders. Welcome.
Hi, it's really nice to meet you. I'm really happy to be here as well too.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you have had the time to have this discussion. How are you and where are you now?
So I'm actually at my studio in Haggerston, so that's East London. So I'm based at the Sarah Brand Foundation. So it's like a little bit of an incubator. So there's artists here and like other designers, people like Craig Green had a studio here, and currently another LVMH nominee, Wed, are here, and a couple other creatives. And I'm doing really well. I'm actually just like in a really exciting point in my life. So I'm just taking it in.
Well, honestly, that's like the perfect bridge to sort of my first question. I mean, last year you were on Forbes's 30 under 30 list, correct? And now this year you're a finalist at the LVMH prize. Your brand has been picked up by all of these really exciting retailers. First of all, girl, congrats. Number one, like, I'm really happy for you. And how does it feel like having kind of like this moment?
It's really surreal. I think most of the time, every time that I speak to my stylist, Karen Binns, and she's just like, you sound like you're not actually taking it in. So I'm like, okay, I need to make sure I'm taking in this moment because I don't know how long it will last for, but it's just like the opportunities that are given to me doesn't happen for everyone. So, and then I think sometimes as well too with fashion, because you're always moving on to the next season so quickly, there's not that much time to kind of sit with the products you made or sit with like the accolades that you made, and just really appreciate it fully. I think for me as well too, because we're in a time where it's a pandemic, there's not so much focus on like other things on in the world. I'm not traveling as much. I'm not meeting as much people in person. So there's more time to actually focus on my craft. So I'm really enjoying that.
Yeah, maybe it's sort of a blessing and a curse, because sometimes you can get quite overwhelmed with that sort of social aspect of everyone being like, oh my God, congrats, etc. So I'm curious. I'm kind of going to get right into it. So obviously, I've read a bunch of your interviews, and in general, at least personally, I've noticed that often when Black people, or honestly any people of color in design, when they're being interviewed by journalists, often, especially if you're, vocal about where you come from and kind of open about who you want to uplift in your work, etc., often there seems to be this mantle of activism, or this idea of like, oh, so you're an activist, you're fighting for this and that, when actually often you're basically just doing things the way you know how to do best. Have you felt that like when you're just talking about your design work, it's like interpreted as activism?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's such a weird, like it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So it's like you can't really run from it, and at the same time, it's like I do like it's good for the community, because there's people who have messaged me recently like, oh, it's really inspired me that you're a Black woman heading a fashion brand and heading a menswear brand on top of that, and the fact that it's like a luxury brand as well too. So that's like another like level to it. Then also thinking about it, I'm like, there's not that many women like me, so every person that exists during this time is creating their own lane and their own version of what it means to be a Black fashion designer. And I think what's quite nice now is that all the designers that I've seen that are doing their thing within luxury fashion now are Black. They're very individual, so it's diversifying exactly what it means. And I think people are starting to actually unlearn the fact of like, just because of like the politicalness that surrounds being Black doesn't mean it's actually political. And sometimes it's just about telling your story, because so many other races are allowed to just tell their story about it being a political edge added onto it. But because we're in such a I don't know, a heavy time where things are kind of like thrown at you, and you kind of have to respond in a way that people feel spoken to. I just go about it and trying to make sure it's authentic to me, because when I started out at the RCA, I felt as though I had something to say, and being visible is quite difficult, but I think it's important for anyone else coming up under me.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I in no mean, mean to say that it wouldn't, because it's just an interesting thing. I mean, obviously, I'm in no way at any sort of similar level as you are, but I've noticed that often in Finland, when I'm being interviewed as a designer of color, I often speak about the sort of intersection of queerness and brownness, that that's what I'm from. That's sort of what's natural to me. So I'm literally just talking about the things that I know. And then it's just this notion of like, oh my goodness, it's so empowering what you're talking about. And I'm like, it's the shit that I know. Like, and of course I can, I'm sure we can both recognize the importance. And then often what happens is like what you say, that people reach out to you and say how important it is. But I think it's just an interesting thing where, like, I'm curious to see when we get to that moment where exactly kind of how you say that this, I don't know, unpoliticization of Blackness in fashion happens, where that can, where we can actually go deeper, because I'm sure there's very specific things, for example, about masculinity that you're seeing and you're doing with your work. And I'm just curious that when do we get to that point? I'm hopeful that we get soon to that point where someone like you as a designer is more like the norm, really, and you can really just talk about the craft. Do you often feel, I mean, you've mentioned in interviews that some of the sort of men in your life have inspired you. Do you feel like when talking with journalists, do you have to like jump through a lot of hoops when you're explaining kind of what you're talking about? And I mean like Black specific things. Do you feel like often you get to have a discussion where you don't need to like, do you understand what I mean? Where you need to like explain a lot of things, or do you really feel like you can have a direct conversation about what you relate to?
I think more so now I have more of the space to do so. But like when I first started out, I found it really like kind of a little bit draining, because basically we're part of like me exploring Black masculinity. It was the fact of like I have like different kinds of male friends. So I have guys that are really involved in like masculinity, and like really like they want to stick to the tropes of like what it means to be a Black male and stuff. And then I have friends who have like, they are very masculine, but it's all about their nuances that kind of show their feminine side. And I really wanted them to kind of exist in the same world. And that was my first output on it. And that's why I called the first project Personal Politics, because Blackness is always seen as political. I don't know why, but I do know why, but at the same time I don't. So just trying to challenge that. But I think more so now, because I've built more of a story about how I exist and how my brand exists, people are seeing it as more artistic. They're interested in like how I present my collections in an interesting way. And they're really starting to understand it more within luxury fashion as a whole. And there's become less of it being in comparison to other Black designers, and being compared to people that are, I guess, doing similar things, like challenging what it means for a male's wardrobe, how to expand that notion. But I think it probably will take, I'm guessing, the next 10 years, or actually not even that, probably next 5 years realistically, because there's so many people that when I was studying, they were studying at the same time. So they're doing their own thing, but more so in terms of it being normalized, not normalized, but like more diverse in big fashion schools and just fashion schools in general, because people are trying out different jobs. So like they'll have kids that will probably be inspired to do something creative and feel as though that their career can survive in this world, which not a lot of people of color believe that. But I think having that example is like, oh, they can bring it to their parents, like this person exists.
Exactly. How was, I think it was on GQ or some of your interviews where you mentioned that you were the only Black person in your class, both in Kingston and RCA. Am I
Yeah.
remembering that correctly? But so I similarly, I was at least the only person with like a Black heritage when I was doing my master's. How was it with the faculty? Were there any people of color or Black people there that you were presenting your work to? That's sort of what I'm curious about.
Yeah, there was. So at the RCA there was David Capo. So David Capo also works at CSM. But what's so weird about it is that like he's probably the only Black tutor in between like those two schools. So it's like you have like one person that's kind of like as a representation. But I think what's nice about him, he was just like, just be yourself. And I found it really difficult because like going to the RCA is like in the middle of like central London against like these like massive art institutions near the V&A and all these other places. So like coming from South London and seeing it's quite diverse, and then like traveling to where I am and then being around people that are from all around the world, and I could be the first Black person they met, I have no idea. So it felt like there was a lot of pressure to kind of represent my, I guess, Blackness and represent people in the right sort of way. And I did get a message from someone recently, a girl who was in my class from Australia, and she was like, oh, like she doesn't come across many people, but she was like really grateful to meet me because then it made her understand what it means to be Black in a way, not fully, but you know, get a better understanding of different people from different walks of life. And the same with like Kingston as well too. I had a tutor, Andrew EB, and he was like my final presentation tutor. So that final push of having someone that was almost like me and understood my references, but it also could push me to another level, because sometimes people who I had tutors, not all of them, but they felt as though they didn't want to upset me because I had these certain references. They didn't want to offend and that sort of stuff. And in order to grow and be a better designer, you need people that are going to push you in the direction that they understand you fully. And then I guess outside of being Black as well too, there was so Zoe Broach, who was head of RCA. She comes from like a working class background, so her understanding of what it is to start a brand with having like nothing, but compared to like most brands, they start off like with loads of money. She knows what it's like to grassroots level, and just it's all about making sure that your concepts and ideas are strong, and then everything else comes after that.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad to hear that you have these tutors, because I think that's one of the most frustrating things. You know, you get into these big institutions, these big, world-renowned fashion schools, but then if you don't get that same level of like deep artistic dissection and conversation as your peers do, then it's kind of, it's not the same thing. Like, it's like, okay, I'm in this school, but like, at least that's what I've noticed that happened to me, that often, teachers, like you said, they don't want to upset you. So it's more of this notion like, oh, like looks nice and that's interesting, but you don't really get to dig deep into the meanings. And I think you seem to pack such a strong sort of sense of subversion, I guess I would say, in your designs, which is one of the reasons why I really like what you do. And I think what you do kind of really nicely connects to the sort of, what, at least to me, I'm not a British person, but like what makes British design and some British designers interesting, like, McQueen, Dame Vivienne Westwood, J.W. Anderson, Dion Lee, okay, again, all white people, I'm sorry, is that sort of sense of, that sort of discrete power and that sense of subversion. Yeah. And what I really like is that you're introducing, almost like arrogantly, you're introducing Blackness into that, because often I don't think that we use words like, I don't know if these are words that you would use about your designs, but like I see a sense of like modernity, minimalism, cleanliness there, and also a softness that I really like. And I think I just feel when I'm reading magazines, etc., that's not often something that you read in conjunction with like Black design or Black designers. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. I think so, because I had an interview one time. There was like, oh, what do you think about the stereotype of like Black people designing streetwear. And I was like, I didn't know it was a stereotype, but now to think about it, because when we think about like past documentaries about Black fashion, is always based around like streetwear and what that's done for like luxury fashion. We don't really talk about like, I don't know, tailoring and all the other things. Of course, there's like people like Casey Hayford and Oswald, but like as a whole, we always look towards America, that kind of like American designers that have made an impact to luxury fashion than it as a whole. And I think it's become a bit more diverse in terms of like where you come from. We're seeing people like, I guess, Kenneth Eze, for example, like a Nigerian designer making like things that you would think wouldn't necessarily be Nigerian fashion, but then you see it, you get to understand his world and see the luxury in it, and see like how it's like very Nigerian but very elevated in how he's like taken his culture in an interesting way.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think it's interesting you mentioned like kind of streetwear and how this is just my interpretation. I often feel like Black and brown, like, or like, at least I can speak from like an African American background, but often like it's either something to do with like, even whether it's like rap or whether it's ballroom, a culture that I sort of relate to, there's always this notion of like, it almost feels like it has to be entertaining in some weird way. That like there's this notion that someone has to, and often it's like entertainment for a white gaze, that this has to be something that's very sort of like, oh my goodness, it's such a beautiful representation of this culture, and like, oh, it's so beautiful to look at. And what I really like I said, like I get like this sense of like quiet power in your designs, which I really, really appreciate.
I think it's kind of down to my personality as well too, a little bit, but then at the same time, like I'm into all of like all of the other stuff. So when he would meet me, and they more so like when they understand my world and stuff like that, or when they come to, like, if I do a fashion party, it's a lot of like dancehall music, but then it's very like classic designs. They don't understand it, but that's just who I am. I'm quite meek but very outgoing, so it's kind of just putting my personality within my own designs. And it's what I kind of, why I'm drawn to luxury fashion, is like it's about craft and about things that are like, oh, I love a subtle detail, I love like things that kind of like move and shift in a weird way. And that's what he will really take up on. And I really want to see people wearing my stuff on the streets as well too. So making sure it's comfortable enough people to wear it, but then also effective enough for people to think it's different. So that creating that balance is really important. And I think that's what creates good brand survival, as well as like interest for people to think that they're actually wearing designer when wearing something that's people want as well too, and that's important. I'm quite empathetic when I think about the user that's wearing it. Do they feel confident? Do they feel like attractive? All of those things I've really considered in the last like 3 collections. I think that's shown a bit more, especially like AW21. It was very a short film, but the man in isolation was very sexy and very like confident.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you mentioned the word sexy, because I feel, and this is sort of going to be my last question, often it feels that if feminine elements that are sort of deemed stereotypically feminine, if those are brought into menswear design, often there seems to be this notion that, oh, then it's gender fluid, that like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, of course that's a different thing, but I'm just like, menswear and maleness and masculinity should have those feminine, sexy things as well.
Yeah.
You agree?
Yeah, no, I think that's what kind of frustrates me a little bit, because people usually assume that my stuff is genderless, and it's not. It's made for made for men. The whole idea of why I haven't done women's wear is just like, I guess, just the power of a woman dressing a man is quite interesting. And the other way around, it seems so normalized for men to dress women. It's never questioned to like, oh, why does a guy that wears shirts make pretty dresses? It's just like, oh, that's normal. because he's got a brilliant mind.
Exactly.
And
Well, exactly. And we love to
yeah,
give the label of genius to a man, you know.
yeah. So it's just, I guess, just a little bit of my feminine activism.
No. No,
So,
that's great because I just, yeah, and in no way, of course, and this has nothing to do with like the user, because obviously, you know, the gender identity of the user can be whatever, but I think it's important that we have designers who make a point about masculinity in their designs and saying that, no, these things that stereotypically are labeled feminine or whatever, gender fluid, that can be part of maleness too. And I think that's you know, really, really interesting in what you do.
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Is there, so you're almost done with your next season. Is there any new, like, what's next? I mean, LVMH prize finals are soon, etc.
So I'm just trying to prepare myself for that moment. So, well, in terms of like potentially we might meet in person. I've met some of the designers recently. So I had a shoot. I met Connor Ives and Nancy. It's so weird because you'll speak to them on Instagram and then I'm like seeing you in real life. So strange.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to like iron out all the kinks with like my own work. So like things that kind of bother me, like I really want the cut on this to be sharper. I want this to be on point. So as I was saying, I had a fitting today, and that was the first fitting for Spring Summer 21, which I'm not showing until September. So having a longer time to develop is really important for me because usually I don't get any time to do any of that stuff. So utilizing what the pandemic has done in a way of like there's not so many distractions about the outside world and meeting people in real life and stuff, and just really focusing on the craft and making sure that I'm leveling it up every season, and also thinking about how I'm going to present the work, because presentation for my brand has become really important, and that's what people kind of like admire about it. They like that it's very eye-catching and makes people think about film and think about like the person behind the character, because not very often you get to hear the model speak. And then I did that for the Gucci project, and also for Spring Summer 21 where the guys are like dancing, or like AW20 where the guys are dancing as well too. It has so energies of movement and personality, so injecting that into the clothing is what would excite the wearer to potentially invest into my brand or even support it.
Yeah, great. I mean, I'm so excited to see what future brings to you. I really wish you the absolute best for the LVMH prize. And thank you so much for taking the time to have this little talk with me.
Thank you. I much appreciate it as well.
No worries. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.